Hello everybody, welcome back to the Overlap Breakdown YouTube channel. As always, I'm joined by my co-host Umir, who's a professional football scout and analyst. And this week we're going to be diving into everything Tottenham Hotspur, talking about Ange's issues currently with the squad, both tactically and technically. Straight away, I want to jump into the numbers and give Spurs the benefit of the doubt, because we've just spoken off camera there about maybe Spurs aren't as bad as some of the results suggest, some of the table suggests. So per game this season compared to last season in the Premier League, Spurs have faced less shots per game, have had more shots per game, have generated more expected goals per game, and have conceded less expected goals against per game, which on the front of it looks like a good improvement for Spurs.
Wise,
The two main factors about football is putting it in that net, stop it going in that net.
Yeah, exactly. You can have all the stats on paper.
Yeah, you can have all the stats, and they've kept the same amount of possession, so that's completely fine. They're still controlling the games, but they are nowhere near getting the results that they need to be getting to show at face value that they are progressing, despite the underlying numbers. And whether you like underlying numbers or not, fans don't buy into them collectively. So. The one thing that I want to talk about per game that Spurs have maybe tried to do more this season is their passes per game last season was at 592 on average, and that is now dropped to 528. And we spoke about the tempo of Spurs has sort of depleted this season, and they've gone to a little bit more of a slower natured approach in possession. So I want you to show us on that side, not only how Spurs set up on the ball, because we all know what they do on the ball is very, very brave, very interesting, very entertaining at times, but it also leaves them open to a lot of chances and stuff. And when you're playing so slowly, it's easier for an opposition to jump, win the ball back, and generate a chance. So I want you to show us what they're doing on the ball, which is maybe causing them to lose a little bit more control in these games. Yeah,
I think with the Ange Postecoglou approach, you've always got like a very brave, very interesting approach at the back. Yeah, it's a very Ange way.
Just do it, mate. Just do it.
And to be honest, I really like the bravery in his approach. It's a little bit similar to how I've spoken about Ten Hag, in the fact that like sometimes your bravery, although admirable, can be your downfall a little bit. So if we're just looking at the team here, what I'm doing is I'm moving the full-backs inside. I've got the two centre-backs back here, your number 6 here as well. You've got your two midfielders that join that back line, and your wingers initially tend to hold the width. As we move forward, as Spurs tend to get some possession in the opposition's third, then these wingers actually go quite narrow, and the general attack is quite narrow to get as many bodies in the box. We've seen the term narrow width or minimal width used to describe teams that have a very narrow back line in order to get more attackers in the box, and that's why we've seen Johnson picking up more goals this season. But if we begin by looking at their defensive shape, you've got two centre-backs here, and then you've got Udogie who comes in here, Porro who comes in here. With the Ange approach, with the Spurs way, especially this season, there's a lot of rotations. Here we've got Papa Matasar recently, we've got Kulusevski. At times this has been Maddison. You got Solanke up top, obviously Johnson and Son on the wings. With the rotations, you're ending up with Udogie moving out to the flank, Son sometimes coming inside, Maddison or Papa Matasar picking up the ball in these almost left-back areas or left-central defensive areas. So there's a lot of rotations in how they move, and that's often how they do try to build up, given that reduced number at the back. There's a lot of onus on these two individual players on their individual ability, on their individual quality, come up with solutions against some of that pressure. And then obviously sometimes the keeper will come in and be that third player because there are so few players. When some of these players push up, you're often left with sort of almost a 2-1-7, which sounds crazy on paper and it sometimes seems crazy in practice. But yeah, that's sort of the actual in possession shape, and you can see some of the issues that might bring out of possession.
So yeah, as Umir's just mentioned, they've moved towards a slightly more aggressive approach in possession, and Ange Postecoglou, as we know, is sort of a manager who, when times are tough and when things are going against him, usually managers backtrack. Ange kind of takes a step forward. We've spoken about this before, and I do like it because it's brave.
It's unique, but there are issues.
There are issues with it, and the lack of pragmatism, can let Ange Postecoglou down. But what they're trying to do this season is here on the board, you can see that Spurs have got like a 2 centre-halves and then 3 midfielders, whether or not the 2 full-backs are inside, the 6 is there, whatever. What Spurs are doing a lot this season is, as Umir was talking about, pushing these players on so far into the opposition's block. And now, I think, you might want to correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this is a term that basically modern football uses, pinning, which is when a team is defending in a block like this, if you push 7 bodies high, that means theoretically the opposition has to push 7 bodies on to mark them lot.
We saw Villa, and Villa tend to naturally drop their wingers back into almost a 6.
Yeah, that's what the 6-2-2. So like when Villa were defending, they defended a 4-4-2. So like Villa would naturally drop in like this, and then these midfielders would cover wide, and these are dropping. And this is how Spurs want teams to defend against them. The problem is when you've isolated your 3 build-up players, so you've got your 2 centre-halves, your central defensive midfielder, against an opposition press like this, them 3 players have to be absolutely spotless in every pass. Yeah. Because if this pass here, let's say that is a 30-yard pass through the lines, which not many footballers in the world can play from them positions. No. You have to be a top 1% centre-half in that position. To get that ball from there to there, bypassing the opposition's press, playing around the front 2 if they're pressing you, it's very difficult. And not only that, obviously in possession, what we're talking about here is structurally they can do a little bit better. This is probably a reason why not only are they pinning teams, so yes, they're generating more chances because they've got more attacking players, but they're also facing less chances because they've now got a defensive structure which is holding the ball. As Pep likes to say, holding the ball is being defensive. Now, in the midfield 3 here, I want to talk to Umir, and I want to kind of touch on this a little bit. There was a conundrum in the West Ham game, which saw James Maddison play brilliantly in the first 45 minutes, but Spurs went 1-0 down to West Ham through Mohamed Kudus, and that caused Ange Postecoglou to change the midfield construction and sub out Maddison, keep Kulusevski, and I'm pretty sure it was Bentancur, in the midfield, and then change this person to Pape Matar who he said in his own mind was more of a jeweler, more of a presser, and that gave them more bite in the midfield. That worked. They went on to win the game 4-1, and they blew West Ham away. Great transitional quality, more box-to-box running. But
also for how they actually improved their defence. So I think if we're talking about that specific situation and what that did, because I think obviously a lot of people will talk about, look, Spurs can't break down teams. You sit deep, play Maddison. Why are they not playing Maddison? Well, I think we can explain it from using that example by a few situations, and it also explains why they've been a little bit poor defensively. So when the opposition team are attacking and they're attacking quickly, you've got a tendency for these 2 central defenders to get dragged into these wide areas because there's a lack of coverage, especially with these players pushed on forward. When these players do move out to these areas, there's a big gap in these central areas for players to attack. Now, if you've got Bentancur in here, he can slot in, but he's only one player. With players like Maddison and Kulusevski, obviously more attack-minded players who are less inclined to track back as intently, you're not going to get the ability to drop in here and cover those central areas. Obviously, when Pape Matar was in, and we can show it on the other side, if we were saying he's playing here, you've got your left centre-back who goes out into these areas and then he drops in here. You've got that central coverage, you've still got your number 6 in here. So I think that makes sense from like a defensive perspective. Additionally, what Spurs did was, and if we just bring it back a touch here, they pressed in a sort of 4-2-3-1 shape in that second half for a little while, I think. And when they did press in that 4-2-3-1 shape, and we've seen this in subsequent games, Kulusevski sometimes has ended up having to be one of the double pivot players. And obviously he's not naturally a defensive player. In this press. If the ball does get bypassed that first line, you don't ideally want Kulusevski in these areas defending. So Maddison was here. Instead, you swap. You put Kulusevski in that number 10 position, and then you get sort of 2 natural pivot players. So that's why it's helped them a little bit out of possession. It's helped them defend those areas at the back. So in theory, you think, look, Ange's made a good change. He solved some of the problems.
It's an attacking change.
It's an attacking change.
Which is how he thinks. It's attack first.
And it also it does shore up the defence a little bit. But then when you're pushing teams in, what does that mean for the in-possession structure, the in-possession personnel, and some of the struggles that brings about?
Well, I'm actually glad you touched on the midfield three in terms of the way they've been using it here, because it reminds me a lot of the conundrum with Casemiro Mount Fernandes.
Yeah.
When United tried to do the similar thing, trying to get two attacking 8s or 10s into the same midfield three with one sitting midfielder.
Yeah.
Now, at the weekend, they lost 2-1 to Ipswich. That is now the second team this season in the Premier League who have got their first win of the season against Tottenham Hotspur, which isn't a good look, obviously. But what you've just said there is exactly what happened for the second goal. If you want to watch the second goal, you can, but I'll briefly just try to explain it. They push up all the way onto Ipswich, and they've probably got about 7 bodies in this part of the pitch. So I reckon
just pop all of these
in here. So this is ideally what it looks like. Obviously, Ipswich have got a couple players forward, and Ipswich kind of play around the block here. Spurs have been sucked onto them. There's a long ball. It drops to Omari Hutchinson, who swivels on the ball and takes it out wide. And as he takes it out wide, Spurs have actually got a pretty decent set-up block in this part of the pitch. They've got 4 defenders on this side. But what Romero does is, because the relentlessness of Spurs' approach out of possession, Romero jumps like this, and the back four maintains its depth. It maintains running back to their own goal. And what this means is now, I think it's Leif Davis on this side, and he plays a ball through this half space here to no one cover him. And it ends up that when the ball gets into the box and Liam Delap's here to tap it in, this player here has got so much space, because not only has Romero jumped out of his position, but Bentancur does not have the legs to make this run through the midfield and cover that zone like you were just saying there with the underlaps.
Yeah.
This has been a situation that Spurs have conceded from. If you watch the West Ham game, they conceded from the exact same situation. Players getting into these sorts of spaces here, really narrow on the box, isolating the defenders man-to-man. And when Spurs haven't got you Van de Vens and your 1v1 quality defenders in the channels, then it really does paint a picture for how bad it can get when you are bringing it on so much. And it's a big problem for Spurs, because you're never going to have perfect conditions as a manager. I
was just going to mention, I think, what we've seen from certain coaches in the past, when you've got a very unique team-wide approach that's based on the individual quality of certain players, then when one of those players are out, the knock-on effect it has is massive. Van de Ven, he has the ability to play 1v1 or take control of these build-up situations when you are so outnumbered. He has the pace to track back and cover in these wide areas like somebody else might not have. Spurs often, in trying to find solutions, utilise the chemistry and the rotations between multiple players. Now, if they've built a nice chemistry between themselves, taking one player out and putting a new player in automatically loses a lot of that good work. It's less pattern-based, it's more based on the chemistry and that sort of nature between those players.
Breaks it up, doesn't it?
Yeah,
it breaks up kind of the patterns and the kind of routines that they're going for at the back.
Yeah.
I wanted to touch on one thing. Spurs, given the benefit of the doubt, have the second youngest squad on average in the Premier League this season, behind only Chelsea, which does show that it is a project, and we know that, of course. Spurs have got a lot of young players coming through. Heung-min Son's kind of the veteran on this left-hand side, but Brennan Johnson, Dominic Solanke, Kulusevski, Bentancur, Porro, Udogie, Romero, Vicario, Van de Ven, they're all really, really young. Yeah. And what I think happens a lot for Spurs this season is they're getting really emotional in games, and it's not just because of the way they're playing. I think the way they're playing adds to it, so the Ange way does intensify it.
Yeah.
But in the Galatasaray game in the Europa League, which they lost, they had 52 ball possession losses within their own half, with 12 of them ball possession losses leading to a direct shot on the goal. That is not naivety maybe in sort of the way that Ange wants to play out the back and constantly bring the ball out, but it also shows that when the game gets in this frantic state where the ball's bouncing from one box to the other, while Spurs can score goals like that, they can concede so many chances.
I was just going to touch upon the Galatasaray game a little bit. I know they were rotated.
Obviously they were rotated,
but there's still a general principle in there that mirrors a lot of what they've done. I think what you've touched upon there is, in how they're trying to build up with those reduced numbers, there's a little bit of a struggle when you don't have these genius players at the back to be able to do that. But what I've noticed from this Ange side is the reluctance to go long, and I know that's a philosophy-based thing, but when you've got a player like Solanke who's come in, who's brilliant at controlling the ball off his chest, if you draw all of these numbers in I know like a really good pressing side can actually try and get at some of these Spurs players now. But when that does happen, I wouldn't be against seeing a ball go direct into Solanke, Son running in off him, because Son's hugging the touchline for the majority of games. And I know he moves in sort of in situations, but when you've got a player like that, you want to get them all in their best zones. I think that's something that we've noticed from these Spurs players a little bit. You've almost had Maddison and Matasar picking up in left centre defensive positions. You've had Son hugging the touchline. You've not got all of your best players in their best zones. As much as the rotations do help them get the ball in time and in space, it's not always in their best zone. So I think both of those points are potential sort of little tweaks that could be made going forward. But, you know, everyone has their own philosophy, irrespective.
Well, I think that's one of the things that we touch on quite a lot with the positional play, the rotations, the strictness of how much it binds players to one position. The rotations, as you're saying, I completely agree. When I watched Erik ten Hag at Manchester United, we were doing a lot of what you're saying there, which is rotating players in positions where it's not really a net positive. Sometimes you'll have like Harry Maguire stood in midfield when it doesn't really suit him. You just said there, you've got Pedro Porro and Udogie kind of coming out wide, which Pedro Porro is better at, but Udogie not really that good. Maddison dropping in to left back positions, as you just said, not really efficient for how they want to play. Obviously, what Ange Postecoglou will be saying is, as we mentioned before, all of their numbers are better this season when you look at it at face value. Their fast breaks per game against, again, all the way up on the other side to being better. They're conceding less shots from fast breaks, less shots per game for fast breaks. They're not really getting counter-attacked as much as the narrative kind of suggests. But what you're seeing is that when one player's out, when another player's out, when one of the midfielders gets replaced with another one, you can see how it's going to kind of spiral into something that's not going to look too pretty. You just mentioned there that Ange Postecoglou maybe could go more direct into a player like Dominic Solanke, who we've spoken about quite a lot. I was listening to Joe Hart the other day talk about playing under Ange Postecoglou, and he often said that he didn't understand the duties of a ball-playing goalkeeper, and that when Ange Postecoglou came into Celtic, he told him how to play as a ball-playing keeper, what it means, and he mentioned that he had the licence to go into the number 9. He could dink the ball into the number 9, into these zones when a team is right up against you. If you're outnumbered, you know that there's going to be space in the centre to just dink a ball in. I've never seen Vicario play that
I was going to make that exact
I've
point.
never seen it.
Joe Hart's not not a world beater in terms of passing, but I've seen Joe Hart make that pass.
But like runners off him, Kulusevski, powerful runner in the centre. Pape Matasar, powerful runner in the centre. Son, great at coming inside. I mean,
Johnson loves making those runs inside.
The fullbacks are energetic, fast. And I think if I was going to say one thing to Ange Postecoglou as to why wouldn't you change it, obviously he will say going long reduces the chances of retaining the ball and you lose control of the game, which is completely fine. But we've seen managers like Pep Guardiola now, Mikel Arteta, even Arne Slot go more direct now in the Premier League, and it works.
Especially against man-to-man pressure, the spaces will be in the back line when you're matching up 1v1, or you might have sort of extra numbers in and around those areas.
I think Spurs need a proper physical defensive-minded midfielder. Someone who can play in a double pivot out of the possession. I look at someone like Carlos Baleba, for example. Brilliant player, big lad, can carry the ball through midfield, can win the ball back, can go end-to-end, box-to-box. That kind of player.
And this is not to downplay Matasar. I think Matasar has some of those qualities.
Yeah, he does, for sure. I think he's a useful player. I think Ange Postecoglou has noticed how good he can be when he needs to go more pressure, more box-to-box running. But yeah, I think Spurs are missing a few key parts for me. And in the transfer window, they targeted a lot of young players. Lucas Bergvall, Archie Gray, Odobert, Solanke, and these are players who, as we mentioned before, are part of a project and they're going to come up and up. And Archie Gray might be able to be that shuttling midfielder who can block the ball.
I like him in midfield, but the Premier League's
it's a different kettle of fish.
But,
and obviously, Ange is using him currently as a centre back or a right back
who moves inside.
So I was really surprised when I seen Odobert dropped right in. I was really surprised, but now it sort of makes sense because what we mentioned before is that Spurs have maybe not slowed down, but they're playing far less passes this season.
Yes.
That is a fact. Like, they're playing 70 or more passes less per game,
Yeah.
which shows that they are slowing the game down.
And teams are sitting off them a little bit, probably.
Yeah, and like you were saying there, they congest the centre, so you can't really find Maddison in the pockets, can't really find Kulusevski in the pockets. Solanke's in a really tight space in the area and just outside the area here. One thing that we've noticed about Manchester City teams in the past that have gone through this stage where teams are sitting in the more compact, they're denying City of these spaces. Obviously, you've got the guys who kind of roam outside the block and pick it up.
The three here.
We've seen Chelsea do it where Palmer's almost running all the way to the touchline to get in.
Your crosses, your in-swinging crosses from here, your overlaps here.
Yeah.
You're attacking the box, but also you're trying to facilitate the passes back for long shots on the edge. That's something I've not seen actually from Ange's team massively. Yeah,
it's a good point, and I think the number one thing that I was going to touch on was the 1v1 quality that City have now got in the team. Obviously, this isn't the best version of City, and we are going to cover that. This isn't the best version of Manchester City, but one thing they've grown into recently in the past few years is 1v1 quality on the wings. You have to have players who can take it both ways, can also retain the ball, but can play down the line. They can play cutbacks, they can play nice crosses, they can get beyond, they can link up with the players underlapping. Spurs at the moment, I feel like, don't have that. If you had to say one thing, I think for me, the one thing that Spurs need to work on is just, I don't want to say going away from the principles, because I think when you show a first sign,
we've spoken very positively about the principles, haven't we?
I think when Spurs or when teams go, like, if you're playing really short out the back and then you start to see long balls, it's like, oh, he's actually give up on the system. And I don't want to say that, but getting the balance right is key. We've seen Pep Guardiola adapt, we've seen Mikel Arteta adapt, we've seen all these managers adapt. Don't be afraid to drop the ball into the 9, play a cross-field switch to Son, lift the ball off the floor a little bit, get in behind and make the game more end-to-end. Because I think when the game goes more end-to-end, I think Spurs have got power in behind. Obviously, you're going to concede 2 or 3 maybe, but I think Spurs have got 2 or 3 more goals in the team itself. So I think for me, adaptability would be the one thing that I'd say to Postecoglou. Not overly adaptable, but just a little bit. What would you say?
I'd say just structure-wise, probably just dropping one extra player behind the ball. I think the 2-2 or the 2-1 or the 2-3, because of the rotations, the 2-3 does become very exposed. I think, and a 3-1 shape is still fairly aggressive. I think a lot of sort of analysts and people in the football world look at it and say, look, it's vulnerable to being attacked. But I think a 3-1 actually does leave 4 behind the ball, whereas at times Spurs have had only sort of 3 behind the ball. I think that if you keep that structure as it is like that, someone like, I know Porro's a brilliant player, but, and I wouldn't say drop Porro, but maybe if I'm just coming up with a hypothetical situation here, if you put Davies in here, for example, you put your 2 centre backs here, Udogie hugs the touchline. You got Papa Matasar, you get Kulusevski in here, Son drops in some of these areas. You get Solanke here, and then you get Brendan Johnson here. He can move inside, Kulusevski can push here, and you still got like a fairly strong base there. I think that as a general solution looks to keep your principles.
You're asking for more like tweaks within the personnel, within the structure. I mean, so for example, you made a really good point here about Kulusevski being in these spaces and Brennan Johnson, and they can switch. And then obviously you don't have to count on Pedro Porro. You can drop a centre half into there, make a back 3, so it's more balanced. I think I'd agree with that. I think, as we've said, Spurs are really heavy metal. I don't see any shame in adding a defender or a plus one in the structure.
Because this guy can still push up here.
Yeah, you can do it in
You're just not having him
games.
here. You're just having him, sort of able to play in these areas.
Because I think we never see the 2 and the 3 anymore from Spurs, which is what I seen a lot. But
even if this guy pushes forward, I think having that 4, that 4 is still fairly strong, rather than ended up in situations where you're like this. And given those rotations are still good, but can you get your best players here? Either Udogie here, Son here, and then your sort of less centre back here. So look, generally I still think they're good. I just think there are sort of 1 or 2 things that we can keep an eye on to elevate the project a little bit. But it'll take time regardless. And interesting to see how it develops.
Yeah, well, it's not a crisis at Tottenham Hotspur yet. I think we're still very much in the boat that they are a good football team and the results will come. And they have got the depth within numbers now that shows that they can go and play in Europe and come out and do well. But they are a team in limbo. So, yeah, that's going to be it for today. Thank you very much for watching. If you did enjoy, please like, comment and subscribe to get all your weekly podcasts and tactical analysis. And we'll see you again next week. Thank you very much.